An ordinary summer sky, faded from heat and exhaust fumes, hung over the city, and only a light haze over the high-rise buildings indicated the distant industrial zone. In the central square, people stood in line for street ice cream. They argued about discounts and looked at a huge screen advertising a new smartphone. A man of about 10 years old wearing a t-shirt with a cracked print and with a dark backpack on his back. He stood a little to the side of the fountain, leafing through a comic book. His mother called him closer, trying to hold him like that, so that not a single strange silhouette would slip between them, and she adjusted his belt, sighing as usual. The child wanted to finish watching the video on the screen, where the hero stopped a falling meteorite with one blow, and inside him a dream of a power capable of protecting everyone around him awakened. However, his mother hurried him, reminding him that he had things to do at home, and that the fountain in the city center will splash under this same sky again and again. At that moment, the sky seemed to change its mind about remaining the same. A barely noticeable, trembling seam ran along it, at first resembling an optical defect. Several people standing closer to the screen automatically raised their heads, trying to figure out whether it was a trick of the light or a strange new advertisement. The seam stretched into a thin, glowing line, crossed the advertising screen, burned through the image, causing the picture to twitch, and the sound of the speakers was drowned out by a strange low hum that made the metal parts of the lantern and the railing vibrate. The pigeons on the roof of the town hall suddenly took flight. The mother squeezed the child's shoulder tighter, and the usual tone of conversation was replaced by a heavy silence. People around started turning around, not understanding what to look at, until the glow of the line became so strong that it became impossible to ignore the thin wound cutting through the blue dome over the square. The line trembled, as if someone had pulled the edges of an invisible fabric, and in an instant it swung open, turning into a gaping, broken arch. There were no clouds or familiar colors inside, only a deep, cold light, which made even those standing in the shadows get goosebumps. The first screams did not sound immediately. At first, a whisper of surprise spread across the square, attempts to joke to calm down nervous laughter. Someone took out a phone and started filming, commenting on what was happening in a trembling voice. Within seconds, a stream of air emerged from the crack, snatching packages from hands and lifting pieces of paper from the pavement. The child felt the hair on his arms stand on end, as if he had gotten too close to an old television. His gaze was fixed on the core of the rift, where vague shadows began to appear, slowly thickening into denser outlines, not resembling either airplanes or birds. The mother instinctively dragged him to the nearest entrance to the underground passage, repeating the old instructions to herself. But out loud, she only whispered about the need to leave before the police cordoned off the square. Taking even a few steps proved difficult because the air was pulling me back towards the fountain, as if someone had reversed the direction of the wind and strengthened it into an invisible funnel. At the edge of the fountain bowl, the water rose in an unusual wall drawn towards the center, and then flew apart when the first impulse passed through the rift without colliding with anything material. It was blinding and devoid of warmth, leaving behind only white spots in the eyes. The child tripped and fell to his knees, hitting his palms on the stone slabs. The backpack hit my back unpleasantly, and for a second my hearing was plunged into a deaf silence, where there were no screams, no hum, only the rapid beating of the heart. He raised his head and saw that the figures of people around him had turned into blurry dark silhouettes. In this milky shadow, new outlines hung over the square, tall, elongated, with angles unfamiliar to the human eye. In places where people would have eyes, cold spots glowed, repeating the color of the rift. It was to these points that the gaze of all who could still look up was drawn. The mother covered the child's head with her hand, pressing him to herself, but her other hand was shaking, clutching the strap of his backpack as if it depended on it whether he would stay here or disappear into this white hum. Every breath she took was an effort, as the pressure from the sky descended downwards like a physical mass. One of the men in uniform, who was on duty outside the city hall, pulled out a weapon, but he only took a couple of steps before his movements became viscous, as if he were walking on water. Then the dark figure by the fountain raised his hand, and the air between them cracked with an invisible blow. The child didn't see any details, just a flash and the man falling to his knees, dust and pieces of tile rising around him. His gaze was drawn again to the rift, where the light became even brighter, and for a split second it seemed that this light is looking straight into him, leaving a thin trace of cold inside. The sirens, which had begun to wail somewhere on the outskirts of the square, overlapped with the roar of the fault, creating a cacophony that made you want to cover your ears. My arms and legs wouldn't obey, and only when someone shouted about the need to go into the dungeon. The crowd surged forward, turning into an avalanche of bodies rushing towards the only visible exits. The mother pushed her child toward the stairs, losing the bag of groceries, which scattered across the pavement. He remembered the bright red logo on the crumpled plastic, contrasting with the gray stone. Before his view was blocked by someone's shoulder and back, he was dragged down towards the dim light of the lamps. The underpass smelled of old concrete and dampness. The lamps overhead flickered, creating islands of light in the general darkness. The people descending the steps turned into a chain of shadows that pushed each other. They tried to find a place near the walls, covering their heads, although the debris had not yet reached here. The child lost his mother's hand for a second and turned around, trying to see a familiar silhouette among the shoulders and backs. But another wave of incoming people covered him, pressing him against the wall so that his backpack rested against the cold stone. He clutched the fabric of the straps with his fingers to keep from falling. When the metal doors of the shelter closed with a dull sound, cutting off the remaining light from the square, the world narrowed to the dim glow of emergency lights and a multitude of faces sculpted by fear and fatigue. The child tried in vain to find the only thing that was familiar among them, remembering every line on his mother's face. The night spent in this concrete stomach of the city dragged on endlessly. Time was measured not by clocks, but by rare messages over the intercom, where short phrases were spoken about new faults in other areas, about the involvement of the military, and that it is better not to go to the surface for now. The child sat on the cold floor, putting his backpack under him, and tried to count his heartbeats so as not to hear snatches of his neighbors' conversations. They already contained words about the dead, the missing, about monsters appearing above, which were not affected by ordinary weapons. Each new rumor was more terrible than the previous one. When the doors finally opened in the morning, letting in the smell of wet asphalt and burning, people slowly climbed the stairs, as if they were afraid that the fault was still hanging over the square. Every step was taken with effort because no one knew. What will he see up there, except that the old city is no longer waiting for them? The square greeted them with silence, in which the sound of footsteps seemed too loud. The fountain was empty, the bowl was covered in cracks, and the advertising screen hung as a black rectangle with spreading stains. Where yesterday there had been smooth paving stones, there was now a long crack from which a thin steam was rising. The child looked for his mother, but saw only rescuers in masks, people in uniforms, markings on the ground and tents under which covered bodies lay. Every time he tried to take a step to the side, to look under one of the tarpaulins, someone's hand gently but firmly stopped him. Later, in another building where a temporary shelter for survivors had been set up, the child was asked questions and asked to recall details. Memory refused to line up neatly, returning only flashes, smells, and the sound of that home, in which he lost his mother's hand, which he had held so tightly, and then suddenly disappeared. In the following weeks, the city changed. Construction cranes appeared on the sites of destroyed buildings. The news was talking about new gates that had appeared all over the world, and about the first people showing unusual signs after contact with them. It was then that the word ranks was first heard as a new scale of value. The child grew up with this word as an inevitable part of reality. Every time the television showed another hunter closing the dangerous gate, a mixed feeling of admiration and dull envy flared up in his chest. Such people could have prevented those events from happening again. Years later, standing in line at the testing center, the protagonist remembered that day not as a nightmare, but as the point where his life was torn in two. Now, from the readings of the sensors located above his palm, it depended on whether he would remain on that shore where people only look at the sky, or will pass to those who meet the gate face to face. The line moved slowly. People around shifted from foot to foot. Some were joking, others were feeling sick from nerves. Everyone, approaching the door behind which the technician was waiting, froze for a moment, as if in front of an invisible line, which changed not only life, but also the way I looked at my own reflection. The testing room was cool inside, the walls glowing with a soft, subdued light without harsh shadows. The devices stood along the walls, and in the center on a metal stand lay a crystal, which required a hand to be placed on it for the reading system to start working. The technician, a man with tired eyes and a voice that sounded like he had said these phrases hundreds of times, asked the main character to breathe calmly, place his palm on the surface, and not move until the indicators completed the cycle. The technician then turned back to the panel, showing no interest in the person standing in front of him. The protagonist placed his hand on the smooth surface, feeling the cold gradually disappear, giving way to a light, vibrating warmth. The crystal inside the structure flashed with a soft light, and somewhere deep in the apparatus a relay clicked, and a thin beam passed along his fingers, checking every line. A few seconds stretched into a small eternity. The protagonist thought about what he would do if the indicators turned out to be high enough. He imagined himself being assigned to the League's training department. As he dons a reinforced vest and approaches the true gate for the first time, not as a victim, but as one who has come to fight back. The device gave a quiet signal indicating the end of the procedure, and the light in the crystal went out. The technician, without changing his facial expression, looked at the data flashing on the monitor, then turned his gaze to the main character, checking whether the system had correctly linked the results to the person and dryly announced the numbers. The indicators turned out to be below the average threshold, in the same range that those who usually had an auxiliary distribution in their profile fell into. The enhanced physical potential was not confirmed, and magical indicators were at a minimal level. The technician recommended considering low-ranking positions if there is motivation. The protagonist perceived these words as if through a layer of water, and each of them left a small sting inside. In childhood dreams, there was no place for lines about low thresholds and auxiliary positions. But reality, just like that day in the square, did not ask about his ideal scenario. The technician returned to his usual politeness and added that such indicators do not close the path to service, but simply limit access to advanced combat units. If the protagonist still wants to connect his life with a league, he can apply for a contract in the general recruitment system. The protagonist left the room with a piece of paper on which his potential was described in dry numbers. Standing on the steps of the center, he looked at the crowd of people who were still waiting their turn. And I understood that for many this day would be a holiday, and for others it would be a quiet disappointment. In his small rented apartment, there were no memorable photographs or souvenirs, only an old backpack, neatly placed in the corner, and the school club badge he found inside it years after the disaster. The badge lay on the table, like a silent question to himself. In the evening, sitting opposite the badge, the protagonist looked for a long time at the silver surface, in which his face was faintly reflected. He thought that if the rift above the square had not opened then, perhaps his life would have become normal. But it was on that day that he first understood the value of what it meant to survive. A contract with a league for people of his level did not promise either fame or big money. It only contained lines about support operations, escort, and strengthening the perimeter. People like him were needed to hold the peace on the border with the gates, while others struck at the heart of the anomalies. The protagonist signed the application anyway, filling out all the fields slowly and carefully, as if each letter were a small step on thin ice. As he signed, a strange relief filled his chest, as if he had finally aligned the trajectory of his life with a line that began in that square. A few weeks later, a notification arrived about enrollment in a training unit for low-ranking contractors. The note included the date of arrival at the base, a list of necessary things, and a brief reminder about that service in the league, regardless of rank, remains high-risk work. On the day when the protagonist first entered the base's territory, the air smelled of metal, grease, and a hint of ozone from the constantly running barrier generators. People in identical tracksuits moved across the parade ground, and above it all hung massive blocks of equipment, like monoliths of a new world. The instructors who met the new recruits did not differentiate them by level right from the start. On the first day, everyone had the same treadmills, theoretical lessons on the gate structure, and simple mindfulness exercises. The protagonist felt like there was an invisible thin wall between him and those who had higher scores. This wall was not impassable, but it reminded of itself in every glance and intonations, in who was trusted with difficult exercises and who was put in line to carry equipment. Every evening, returning to the barracks, the main character felt a familiar heaviness in his chest, but without the helplessness that the child felt underground. Now he had a path, albeit at the bottom of the new hierarchy. He decided to move along it step by step, as long as he had the strength, because any other choice would mean remaining forever among those who only look at the scars in the sky, without having the slightest chance to even touch their edge with their own hands. The morning at the base began with a sharp metallic signal that passed through the corridors, reflected off the concrete walls, and made the recruits jump out of their beds before their eyes had time to adjust to the pale light of the ceiling panels. The protagonist, not yet fully awake, already felt a familiar heaviness of anticipation in his chest. The barracks smelled of washing powder, old rubber from training boots, and the iron of gun cabinets. Along the aisles, people hurriedly pulled on their jackets, fastened their belts, and cast brief glances at each other, as if trying to guess who would be sent closer to the Real gate for the first time today. The main character sat on the edge of the bed, put his feet on the cold floor, and froze for a moment, looking at his palms, in which, since childhood, dread, a vague shame for his own weakness had lived. This time, the usual feeling was mixed with an acute anticipation of the exam, after which a completely different period of his life could begin. On the parade ground, the morning air was cooler than in the barracks and smelled of ozone from the working barrier generators. A gray sky, scarred with old marks, hung over the chain-link fences of the training area, which had not disappeared over the years and only served as a stronger reminder to everyone why this base even exists. The instructor, with broad shoulders and a short scar near his mouth, walked along the line slowly, like a man accustomed to not raising his voice unless necessary. He announced that part of the group would be assigned to an external escort raid for the first time today. Not to the heart of the operation, but to the periphery, where there are still enough mistakes to prevent going back. The news passed through the ranks like a barely noticeable wave. Some tensed their shoulders, others straightened up defiantly. The protagonist felt his heart speed up too much even for simple distribution, because a thought had been living inside for a long time, that the real road begins not on the training tracks, but where the air around the gate becomes alien. After a short warm-up and equipment check, the recruits were led into the hangar, where along the walls stood boxes with beacons, folding fortifications, and standard sets for field points. Using an electronic map of the city, an officer from the operational sector pointed out the exit area, a suburban industrial strip where a new fault had been discovered overnight. According to preliminary data, the gate was low-class, unstable, but without obvious signs of a major threat. Therefore, a mixed group was sent to the operation. A combat unit for clearing, a support unit for deploying a security line, and a medical unit ready to work at the exit if the situation changes faster than expected. The protagonist listened to the instructions, following the red mark on the map, and tried to imagine this place as alive. Wet asphalt between warehouses, gray hangars, chain-link fences, occasional streetlights. In the midst of a familiar man-made landscape, a crack in the air could lead to a space that defied any earthly logic. As the convoy of trucks pulled out of the base, a faint smell of fuel, heated metal, and tarpaulin could be detected in the back of the trucks. People sat on folding benches, holding the boxes with their knees, and spoke in low voices, as if a loud voice could scare away their luck. The protagonist looked through the gap between the awnings at the city districts floating by. The further the column moved away from the center, the less frequent the residential areas became. In their place appeared warehouses, reservoirs, concrete pads, and vacant lots, where the wind drove dust and scraps of packaging film. It all seemed so ordinary that the thought of breaking through the gate in the middle of such an environment seemed especially wrong. At the landing point, the column was met by an already established outer cordon with barrier tapes, an armored vehicle of the League, and several liaison officers. Between the two warehouse buildings, the air was cut by an oval glow of a dirty blue hue, unlike the standard green gates from the training videos. The protagonist felt goosebumps rise on his forearms, even though the wind was not cold. At that moment, a childhood memory vividly surfaced: a square, a fountain, white light, strange eyes in the rift. These memories were superimposed on the present picture so densely that he had to make an effort to keep his face still. The older hunters stood closer to the entry line, checking interfaces and briefly exchanging comments, wasting no movement. The young crew was immediately directed to unloading, deploying beacons, running power cables to the barrier posts, and preparing a medical evacuation point near the right hangar. The work was familiar from training, but here every metallic click, every unfolded tripod, and every coil of cable was perceived more acutely because the rail gate was pulsating behind my back. A barely audible hum emanated from them, reminiscent of both a distant transformer and the breathing of a huge animal. The protagonist carried the boxes along with the others, feeling the straps cutting into his shoulders, and stealthily glanced at the rift. The surface of the fault would sometimes undulate, as if the shadow of something large was passing behind it, and then calm down again, leaving only an unnatural color and pressure on the temples that no sensor around could detect. Once the perimeter was deployed, the senior officer assigned them to the second escort line and repeated the basic rule: do not go inside without orders, do not try to play heroes, maintain contact with your partner, and, in the event of any unusual changes, retreat to the beacons. He emphasized that a low-threat class does not necessarily mean a low cost of error. The first battle group entered the gate without unnecessary theatrics, simply stepping into the flickering glow. Their silhouettes dissolved into the blue in a matter of seconds, leaving an empty passage outside. A few tense glances and a dry stream of data on the command block tablets, where biomarkers and background levels were monitored. The minutes dragged on slowly, communication communication inside was intermittent, but initial signals confirmed that the combat unit was moving deeper. Their group was ordered to prepare to enter the periphery and secure a safe zone along the inner perimeter. As soon as confirmation is received about partial clearing of the area near the exit, when the command to enter finally sounded, the protagonist felt a strange lightness in his legs and heaviness in his stomach at the same time, as if the body was trying to tear itself apart between the instinct to run and the desire to take that step, which separates the educational stories about the gates from the real encounter with their inner world. He passed through the blue surface of the rift and for a split second lost all sense of up and down. There was no air or light around in the usual sense, only a viscous transitional emptiness. Then the world came together again, sharper, colder, and quieter than any reality he had ever stood in before. On the other side lay a stony valley with jagged outcrops of gray rock, fog right at the ground, and a dark vault instead of a sky, in which thin veins of light moved barely noticeably. It seemed as if someone had left unhealed claw marks on the inside of the world. And from this sight, the main character's back became covered with cold even without the wind. The exit point had already been marked with portable lamps and beacons of the combat unit. A little further on, dark spots were visible on the stone, traces of a recent collision, fragments of the shells of small creatures, and streaks of viscous liquid, reminiscent of oil, only too thick and evaporating too quickly in the local air. The leader of their auxiliary group, with short gestures, arranged the people into positions: 2 to the first aid station, 3 to the barrier line, the rest to deploy the inner contour. The main character received a standard portable beacon in his hands, a cylinder with folding supports, which did not differ in color or weight from those that stood on the base. They worked quickly and almost silently, because the atmosphere inside the gate seemed to swallow up any unnecessary words. The fog muffled the sounds, and every step on the rocky surface echoed dully, as if in an empty temple. The longer the protagonist stayed there, the stronger the feeling grew that they were being watched not from afar, but from within the very structure of the space. The connection started acting up again, first with short bursts of static, then with a loss of some channels. The elder assured that this happens in almost every second unstable gate, but the main character noticed how even experienced contractors' movements become a little more abrupt when the instruments cease to be a reliable support. He bent down, setting the anchor at the base of a low rock ridge. At that moment, one of the outer beacons on the exit line blinked not white, but a cold blue light, exactly in tune with the rift outside, after which it returned to normal mode, as if nothing unusual had happened. None of the others seemed to notice. Everyone was busy with their own area. The protagonist looked at the device for a few seconds, feeling a subtle, unpleasant recognition rising inside him, too similar to that moment of childhood when the ordinary sky suddenly cracked and stopped obeying its former laws. The senior gave the signal to move a little further towards the inner perimeter, because the combat unit requested additional space to maneuver. They moved some of the equipment, laying out a new section of the line, but the deeper their small group went from the exit, the more the air itself changed, becoming thicker and colder. Subtle signs began to appear on the stones underfoot, at first barely noticeable, similar to natural veins of minerals, then more obvious, as if someone had burned a system of broken lines into the rock, going off in different directions. Each such sign caught the reflection of the inner light of the world differently than the rest of the surface. The protagonist involuntarily followed these lines with his gaze, as if they formed a pattern that the brain could not yet read. At that very second there was a dull thud ahead, and the fog began to waver, and a fragment of a message about an unknown structure discovered behind the ridge passed through the communication channel. The command to stop immediately hung in the air. Everyone ducked, checking the direction of the sound, but there was no further blow. A strange silence fell, even denser than before. In this silence, the main character clearly heard something very close. Not steps or breathing, but a thin glass crackling of space itself. He turned to the nearest ledge and saw the fog there swirling into a narrow funnel, and the stone surface, covered with signs, vibrates slightly, as if something huge is slowly waking up underneath it. The sight of this made the protagonist's palms become sweaty, although his hands continued to grip the beacon with trained mechanical precision. The elder ordered not to panic and to finish the circuit, but his voice sounded half a tone lower than usual, which meant that he wasn't the only one who noticed the oddity. At that moment, the communicator bracelet on the protagonist's wrist twitched briefly, and the screen went dark, turned on again, and instead of the standard interface, for a moment it showed an empty dark background. The protagonist blinked, thinking it was another communication failure. However, the next second a translucent outline appeared before his eyes. Not tied, it seemed as if reality itself had imposed another layer on top of the surrounding world, visible only to him. The outline was a cold silver, without league logos, without the standard rank and status icons, just thin borders and lines, which at first seemed like a meaningless set of symbols, but then began to form into understandable words, entering not so much into vision as immediately into consciousness. The protagonist froze mid-step, feeling a current running through his spine, and with it comes back the same cold that struck the body in the square on the day of the first catastrophe. The difference between past and present was reduced to one common sensation dash. The world again looked at him not as a random witness, but as a marked point. There was no name reference in the interface, only the designation of a contract soldier with a 0 basic clearance value and an indication of the possibility of switching to experimental mode. Below was a silent countdown, each number seeming to hit me in the chest. The contractor turned his gaze to those around him. The senior officer gave commands. 2 contractors dragged the power supply to the barrier line. One of the battle hunters was returning to the exit point with a broken shoulder pad. None of them noticed that the contractor was faced with a new system that had been secretly revealed to the world and had no intention of sharing itself with just anyone. The thin lines below the main block began to change, showing the conditions of the first verification. Leave the designated safe sector, install 3 beacons using a hidden scheme, and remain in the instability zone until synchronization is complete. A warning about forced termination of access in case of refusal appeared at the bottom. The contractor's mouth instantly went dry from the clarity and cruelty of the wording. An inner feeling told me that behind the words about the end of access there was more than just a loss of opportunity, but something close to cutting off the very possibility of ever again touching this layer of reality. An old anger arose within the contractor, directed not at anyone in particular, but at the role of a weak observer that had been imposed on him by his rank numbers and instructors, distribution tables, and a world where the right to step forward was always given to the strongest, and the rest could only carry the boxes and wait for the results of other people's decisions. The countdown continued, and each waning second seemed to burn away the remnants of the hesitation. The red bag in the square, the mother's hand leaving her fingers, black silhouettes in white light flashed in my memory, and the empty look of the technician, who dryly informed him that the maximum a contractor could achieve was the lowest auxiliary line. The contractor didn't say a word, gripped the beacon handle tighter, and mentally gave his consent. In response, the interface trembled as if it had caught the right frequency, after which the top line changed, securing for it a status in which 0 no longer sounded like a sentence, but turned into the beginning of an unknown sequence. At the same moment, one of the beacons on the line flashed blue, now a little brighter, and the fog at the rocky ridge responded with a slight movement, like the surface of the water from the first stone thrown. The contractor felt the world around him become clearer, deeper, and more dangerous, as if someone had removed the filter that kept reality in a safe blur. The senior officer called out to the contractor, demanding that he complete the sector and not fall out of tempo. The contractor nodded automatically, maintaining an outward calm, but inside he already knew that this short command marks the beginning of more than just the first real raid of his service, but a completely different line of life, on which the weakest contractor can become a point through which new strength will be revealed. The fog near the rocky ridge continued to breathe barely noticeably, like living tissue, and each new curl of it repeated the same strange rhythm that flared up in the line of lighthouses after agreeing to the experimental mode. For the contractor, the inner world of the gate no longer seemed like just a danger zone, but was turning into a mechanism that was trying to pull him deeper. Outside, the same order was maintained. The senior officer was giving orders, the combat unit was reporting on its progress, and the barriers on the periphery were gradually closing into a circuit. Behind this working noise there was another current, in which every tremor of air and every line on the stone seemed to be connected with a new status of the contractor before his eyes. The interface didn't disappear completely, it just faded to the edge of vision, like a thin notch on glass. As soon as the contractor turned his attention to another beacon or pattern under his feet, the translucent lines came to life, revealing a hidden pattern, invisible to everyone else. The world began to be divided into a public and a private layer right within one space. The contractor pretended to be busy with his usual work, moving cables, checking fastenings, and helping to unfold the supports of the temporary shield. At the same time, he felt that the internal anxiety was no longer similar to the fear of an ordinary ordinary contractor who found himself inside the gate for the first time. A heavy anticipation of something destined specifically for him appeared in her. A few minutes after accepting the status, the interface flashed again. This time, instead of a general heading, a clear block of the first active verification appeared, where it was stated without further explanation that synchronization of the unstable zone requires 3 hidden points that do not coincide with the official outline of the league, and completion is possible only with the personal presence of the bearer. The dry formulation was accompanied by a new time scale, moving downwards much faster than before. Below was a line about forced access termination in case of failure. Although the words were almost technical, they carried the same pressure as the warning a minute earlier, as if the world itself offered not a choice, but a test of readiness to move on. The contractor felt a tightening in his stomach, because now it was no longer a matter of mental agreement, but of real action, which required going beyond the safe circuit, bypassing orders from a superior, and discreetly installing beacons where, according to protocol, no one should be. The price of a mistake here was measured not only by a reprimand. At that moment, the senior officer sent 2 contract soldiers to the medical point and 2 more to the right supply line. For a short period of time, a rare window arose when everyone found themselves so occupied with their own area that a few extra steps to the side could dissolve in the general bustle of the operation if you move confidently enough. The contractor squatted down next to the nearest equipment box, as if checking the fasteners, and pulled out one of the spare beacons, a standard, unremarkable cylinder. As soon as the palm closed on the body, an almost imperceptible blue vein ran along the metal, instantly collapsed back inward, as if to indicate that the device had already been accepted by the system. The interface immediately showed the first hidden point outside the current contour, at a rocky outcrop where the lines on the rock formed a semicircle that was invisible on a regular map of the area. A subtle guideline appeared along the route, barely noticeable, but absolutely clear to the eye, caught by a new level of perception. The contractor straightened up, took a cable reel in his other hand as camouflage for movement, and after waiting for the power supply to be dragged nearby, he moved along with the general movement. Then he separated himself by half a step, 2, 3, as if he was simply looking for a more convenient line of detour along the uneven stone surface. Outside the official perimeter, the air was denser than inside the work area. With each step, the contractor had to apply a little effort, as if he were entering not fog, but invisible water. At the same time, a strange adaptation that had already begun to operate smoothed out some of the pressure, preventing the body from breaking into panic. The first hidden point was located at the base of a stone arch, which from the main line of observation looked like just a pile of rock. From here it opened up as a solid form, covered with fine carved seams filled with a gray-blue glow. Just looking at those seams made my ears ring with a familiar metallic tone. The contractor placed the reel on the ground, unfolded the lighthouse supports, and crouched down so low that his silhouette would not stand out above the edge of the ledge. My heart was beating hard, each beat echoing under my bulletproof vest, and my palms inside my gloves were getting wet, despite the cold air and the numbness of my muscles. When the bottom latch clicked into place, the interface confirmed the installation accuracy with a short flash of light. At that moment, a ripple passed across the arch, as if the stone had become liquid for a second and then solidified again. There was more light pulsing in the seams now than before, and this light seemed not hostile, but recognizing. With the response of the first point, it was as if an invisible membrane in the contractor's head had slightly parted. He heard more clearly the distant battle on the left flank, the rustle of fog on the low stones, the clicking of the elder's transmitter, and even his own breathing, broken into layers, as if his senses had suddenly learned to work in a wider range. The new guide instantly realigned itself, showing a second point closer to the area where the unknown structure had recently been spotted. One glance in that direction caused a warning instinct to rise in the contractor's chest. The interface didn't allow for a pause. The timer continued to count down, requiring either movement or an admission of weakness. The contractor picked up the beacon and moved on, no longer bending so low. A strange, elastic composure appeared in the body, as if the internal trembling had begun to be processed into something more useful, into a concentration where fear did not disappear, but ceased to paralyze and turned into fuel for precise movements. The closer the main character got to the second point, the more the landscape around him changed. The lines on the stone became thicker, and in some places the fog curled into motionless pillars. And above the ridge, short streaks of light flashed, reminiscent of return lightning without sound. Each such flash brought back to mind the reflection direction of the first rift over the city. The second point was located almost at the very edge of the depression, where the surface of the world seemed to fall half a meter down, forming a ring-shaped ledge. In the center of the depression, the air was slightly distorted, making distant contours blurry and jagged, as if something from the other side was looking through a transparent but curved lens. The protagonist paused only to take a breath, as looking too long into the center of the hollow caused pressure on the back of his head. He quickly unfolded the beacon, feeling his fingers momentarily lose their usual dexterity as they succumbed to the viscosity of the anomalous zone. The thin contours of the interface that flashed over the gloves prompted the hands to perform the correct sequence of actions. As soon as the lighthouse fell into place, the hollow responded with a quiet, almost inhuman sound, something between an exhalation and the ringing of glass. The air above its center gathered into a short wave, revealing beneath it a fragment of a smooth surface with the same marks. What he had already seen on the rocks, only deeper and clearer, as if it were the main seal of the entire zone. At that moment, a warning about the growth of background risk flashed before the protagonist's eyes. The interface highlighted the third point, the farthest one, almost at the invisible line separating the working part of the space from an even darker sector, where even combat hunters did not go, preferring to stay closer to the cleared route. He turned back to the main perimeter for a second and saw that the normal course of the operation was still going on there. People were moving, lighthouses were blinking, someone was waving their hand through the fog. This discrepancy between their world and what was happening to him intensified the almost painful feeling of loneliness, as if the new system had already erased him from the overall picture. The third point required passing through an area where the ground underfoot seemed unreliable, and every step sent a strange shock through my knees, as if the stone below was springing and breathing rather than lying there as a dead weight. This abnormal mobility caused the protagonist to have a primal desire to turn around before the surface gave way beneath his soles. He walked slowly, distributing his weight and following the thin line of the route in the interface, which at times almost disappeared in flashes of interference and then reappeared. At some point, a silhouette too fast and long to be human flashed out of the fog on the right, which made him stop abruptly and listen until his temples hurt. The silhouette no longer appeared, but the tension had already settled in the muscles as a hard layer. When the protagonist finally reached the third point, his hands moved almost automatically. He pulled out the clamps, set the supports, turned the lock, and pressed the base into the crack between the slabs. Inside, everything was accompanied by the sound of blood pounding and a dry taste of fear in the mouth. The last beacon did not activate immediately. At first the body shook, then it went into darkness for a split second, and only then a vertical thread of blue light cut through it. This thread instantly connected in the interface with the two previous points, forming a closed figure, the sight of which made the protagonist's chest click painfully. The world responded to the completion of the scheme with a delay of a couple of heartbeats. At first, the fog throughout the anomalous zone began to tremble in a circular motion. Then the sounds around seemed to move apart, freeing up an empty space in the center of perception. Only after this did a heavy, very low rumble come from the depths of the rocky valley, similar to the awakening of a huge mechanism under a layer of stone. The interface immediately showed that synchronization had begun and then displayed a new request dash. Stay inside the figure until the end of the cycle, without leaving the zone of personal resonance. This meant that returning to the task force right now was not possible, even if my insides were screaming to run back to the familiar beacons and the orders of my superior. The protagonist stood in the center of the formed diagram, feeling how the space around him was gradually drawn towards him. The three dots didn't just mark territory, they punched a hole in the unstable fabric of the world through which exchange now took place. The exchange passed right through his body, causing shivers in his back and aches in his joints. At first the pain was bearable, similar to the intense strain after a training run. But after just a few seconds the muscles began to feel like they were being pressed into by hot needles. A noise of alien fragmentary impulses arose in my head, without words, only pressure, direction, and an inhuman antiquity that clouded my consciousness. The protagonist clenched his teeth so hard that his temples ached, maintaining his balance in the center of the flickering diagram. He understood only one thing. If he takes a step back now, everything will end, and with it, not only the incomprehensible chance will disappear, but also that tiny crack in one's own destiny, through which, for the first time in a long time, the light of opportunity broke through. Scenes that didn't look like memories began to flash at the edges of my vision. Stone halls without ceilings, figures in in heavy armor, light rifts opening one after another, and the people standing before them not as victims, but as guards. It all passed too quickly to be understood, but clearly enough that the body responded to what it saw with a shiver of recognition. The synchronization timer crawled down painfully slowly, and each jump was accompanied by a new blow deep in the bones. Along with this came another change. The pressure from the zone, which had previously pressed down from above, now increasingly bypassed him tangentially, as if the environment was beginning to restructure its attitude towards the bearer of the new status. When it was almost finished, a sharp click and a short hiss came from the fog outside the circuit, as if a small but dangerous entity was moving there. For the first time, the protagonist clearly understood that synchronization does not go unnoticed. It already attracts what lives on the periphery of the unstable sector and senses changes before people do. He didn't see the enemy, but he felt its presence like a prick between his shoulder blades. At the same second, the interface issued a short line about the registration of the external observer, not allowing either to classify the goal or to move on to a new task until the current one is completed. It felt almost like a mockery, as if the system was testing not only strength but also endurance under the pressure of the unknown. Finally, the last mark of the cycle flashed. The diagram under his feet went out, and it was as if a portion of icy air was sucked into the main character, not into the lungs, but deeper into the nervous system itself. Along with this wave came instant relief, after which the body became simultaneously light and extremely collected. The interface expanded wider than before and displayed confirmation of successful verification, securing the zero status, unlocking the first passive function of adaptation to energy distortions and partial expansion of the sensory channel. Below, almost like a mockery, was a dry note stating that the carrier had survived and was cleared for the next level of testing. The protagonist's breathing did not even out immediately, but when he took the first step out of the center of the extinguished scheme, it became clear that something inside had changed. The fog no longer pressed so heavily on the eyes. The stones were more clearly visible in the relief, and the source of the distant rustling to the right was defined not as an abstract danger, but as a specific point in space, still hidden but real. It was then that a dangerous entity emerged from the fog, short, long-armed, covered in armored plates like wet obsidian, moving sideways at a frightening speed. Her joints seemed to be positioned in a different place than biology dictated, and the gaze of the two narrow, glowing slits immediately found the protagonist without hesitation. He had no orders to engage in combat. He was of low rank and had almost no weapons other than a short emergency blade on his belt. However, the new sense of space kicked in before panic. Even before the creature had taken off, he already knew the vector of its movement and managed to step to the side half a foot earlier. Then the claws cut the air where the neck was. The blow missed, leaving a long scratch on the breastplate. The shock of one's own survival was so brief that it hardly had time to take hold, because the next movement of the creature was already from below, in an arc. For some reason, his trajectory was predictable, as if adaptation had changed not only his body, but also his perception of danger. The protagonist retreated behind a stone ledge, drawing his blade. For the first time in his entire service, he felt not helplessness before a more powerful creature, but a tiny but real window of response. Not victory, not confidence, but at least the right to make a choice in a split second, and not wait for someone else's power to decide everything for him. The creature lunged again, clinging to the rock with its claws and tearing off pieces of rock. At that moment, one of the contractors finally let out a human cry, noticing movement in the fog, but he was already acting on his own, shifting the body along the line suggested by the new feeling, and thrust the blade into the place where a narrow, vulnerable gap flared up between the plates on the side of the creature. The blade didn't go in deep enough. It didn't have enough strength or length to reach the handle, but this was enough for the creature to twitch, break off its trajectory, and jump back with a shrill wheeze. A wave of dim light ran across its shell, as if the very contact with the bearer of the status was more painful for the creature than simple steel. Then an external signal shot from one of the combat hunters struck the fog. A pulse of light flashed across the space, and the creature instantly dove into the gray haze, disappearing as quickly as if it had never been there, leaving behind a few dark drops on the stone and a sharp smell of hot mineral mixed with rotten dampness. The lead contractor remained standing, breathing heavily and looking at the blade, along the edge of which thick black mucus was slowly flowing. At this time, the interface calmly registered the first confirmed contact with a border entity, noting that the adaptation field worked successfully in a real conflict, although the fact itself almost cost the contractor his life. When When two contractors and a senior officer finally ran up to him, their faces were tense, and questions poured out one after another. Where did the creature come from? Why was he beyond the contour? Why didn't he immediately report the sector shift? The lead contractor, hiding the trembling in his hands, replied that he had seen movement in the fog and had managed to evade the attack on instinct. The elder cursed through his teeth, but seeing the scratch on his breastplate and the mark of the blow on the stone, he did not press further. He ordered the entire group to move closer to the exit and immediately hand over to the combat link. That an unaccounted mobile creature has been detected on the outskirts, capable of slipping past a standard sweep. The contract soldiers retreated in an orderly but quick manner. The lead contractor walked in the general group, feeling how every cell in his body still remembered the recent synchronization and sudden battle. Along with the fatigue, a new, almost dangerous feeling flared up inside. Even at his level, one can do more than just survive in the shadow of the strong, and already now become the bearer of something that others do not yet notice. When the exit zone loomed again in the fog and the lights of the official beacons grew brighter, the interface collapsed to a thin strip at the edge of vision, leaving only one line. The next verification is available after the media has stabilized. This phrase had a stronger effect than any praise, because it confirmed that the path had only just begun and there would be no return to the previous emptiness. The return to base that day was not accompanied by any congratulations or special words. The column of cars followed the same route through gray industrial zones and empty streets. Only in the back, where people were sitting on folding benches, was there a different kind of silence, denser than usual after a standard low-ranking operation. The lead contractor sat closer to the rear side, holding onto his belt with his hand, so as not to slip during the jerks, and looked at his palms, on which, despite the gloves, it was as if the sensation of someone else's skin under the blade and the heavy blow of the armor on the chest still remained, from which the bib still echoed with a nagging pain in the ribs. The interface behaved calmly. The thin strip at the edge of vision did not expand and did not throw up new tasks. Only occasionally flashed a short sign of internal stabilization. This silence caused a strange discomfort, as if after a loud question, the interlocutor suddenly fell silent, leaving the person alone with his own conclusions. At the opposite end of the truck, two contractors were quietly discussing the creature that had emerged from the fog, exaggerating its size and speed. The third one showed with his hands the trajectory of the blow to the stone. The senior officer was silent, leaning against the wall, and occasionally glanced sideways at the chief contractor, as if trying to resolve a question that had not yet been fully formulated. When the vehicles entered the base, they were met with a standard set of procedures, surrendering weapons, checking equipment for damage, and a short medical examination. Only after this was everyone released to the barracks, but the name of the chief contractor sounded different from the officer's lips, with a slight pause, followed by a request to stay for an additional report. The chief contractor nodded, feeling the familiar chill between his shoulder blades, and remained in the corridor of the medical block, where it smelled of antiseptic, metal, and something sweet and needle-like from medications. The others passed by, casting fleeting glances at him, full of curiosity, but without open questions, as if it is not customary to look at someone else's luck for too long. The curator of their unit and a man in a strict uniform with the emblem of the analytical department on his sleeve entered the room. His face did not express either open suspicion or friendliness, only concentration, typical for people who are used to constructing other people's destinies from readings and numbers on the screen. They offered the chief contractor a chair opposite a simple table on which lay a tablet, several sheets of forms, and a recording from the internal camera of one of the lighthouses. The curator, softening his voice slightly, asked him to tell in order what exactly he saw before the entity appeared and why he ended up beyond the established perimeter. The chief contractor recounted the events without dramatization, with restraint, as he had been taught. He emphasized that he noticed strange behavior of the fog near the rocky ridges. I decided to check a possible bypass route for the cable and already saw movement there. After that, instinct kicked in, allowing me to avoid the first blow, and then the others had time to react. The analyst listened attentively, sometimes making notes, sometimes scrolling through the recording on his tablet, where a blurry silhouette actually emerged from the fog, too fast for the camera to focus. The footage showed the creature moving away a split second before, as a smeared dark trail passes over the place where the contractor stood. At one point, the analyst asked if the lead contractor had felt any changes in his background before the entity's appearance. Dizziness, tinnitus, pressure. The contractor paused, nodded, and said that in the zone there were several areas with unusual air density and a ringing sound that made you want to cover your ears. This has already been described in the basic instructions for unstable gates. The curator exchanged a brief glance with the analyst, in which a hint of caution flashed, and asked whether the chief contractor had had any unusual reactions to the gate before this incident that were not recorded by the instruments. The question briefly brought back memories of his childhood and the first rift over the square. He answered reservedly that after that disaster, he sometimes experienced headaches near the old zones, where the gates once were, but doctors attributed it to post-traumatic stress disorder. No particular abnormalities were found in the tests, and throughout his life this was considered a weakness rather than an advantage. The analyst nodded, wrote down something else, and after thinking for a bit, noted that the chief contractor's reaction to a surprise attack still goes beyond the average for his rank. He asked if the contractor had the feeling that he had foreseen the trajectory of the strike in advance, but did not see her at the moment of the creature's movement. This question sounded too close to the truth not to be touched. The lead contractor remembered how the body itself stepped to the side, how the line of impact was red before the claws cut through the air. He answered honestly that at that second everything happened faster than thoughts, as if someone had quietly led him to the right position in advance. However, this can also be attributed to a lucky coincidence, because he already felt the second blow as a real risk. The curator smiled slightly at the corner of his lips, noting that the League always pays attention to those who survives thanks to luck twice in a row, especially in situations where most would be unprepared. He warned that the contractor might have to undergo additional testing at a specialized center to rule out or confirm any atypical parameters. The chief contractor left the office with light legs and a heaviness in his head. He understood that any additional attention from analysts could open the way to the upside, but it's just as easy to end up with him being placed in the research unit as a subject rather than a fighter. In this scenario, the roles will again be distributed without taking into account his own wishes. The usual noise filled the barracks that evening. Someone was discussing the raid. Someone was complaining about scratches and fatigue. Someone was arguing about bonuses. When the main contractor entered, the conversation died down for a moment, giving way to brief glances in his direction. And then he walked again, only now with a hint of respect mixed with a cautious distance. One of the contractors patted him on the shoulder, noting that he had gotten away from under the clutches beautifully, and there was genuine admiration in his voice. Another one chuckled and said that perhaps he should have shown such tricks earlier to get a higher rank. There was no malice in these words, but there was that something that always separates those who are a little more fortunate from the rest. The protagonist replied briefly that he was just lucky and sat down on his bunk, feeling ambivalent. On the one hand, he was finally noticed as something other than a statistic, carrying boxes, but as a person who has experienced something that goes beyond the usual scenario. On the other hand, he understood that the real changes were known only to him for now. When the barracks fell silent in the evening, the light burned dimly above the passages, and outside the narrow window the sky darkened with frozen scars from previous catastrophes. The protagonist sat up in bed, leaned his back against the wall, and allowed the gate system interface to fully unfold for the first time that day, without fear that anyone would notice the strange expression on his face. The translucent panels emerged one after another, now containing more structure than when they first appeared. The Zero Awakening status was secured. The first passive adaptation function was marked with a green activity marker, and a short statistic was neatly listed next to it. Successful retention of an unstable zone, survival upon contact with a border entity. Below, a new block opened, still half darkened, with the name of the next verification no longer related to the zone itself, but to people. Words about the need to maintain access to the experimental mode in the event of a collision with external pressure could be read through the darkness. Next to it, there was a timer without numbers, only with an empty waiting scale. The protagonist realized that the system is not limited to the gate space. The next stage will concern what is happening outside of them, at the base, in relations with the League organization. This opened up a whole different type of risk, where the enemy wasn't just the creature from the fog, but also the world's own structure, in which any non-standard element can become a threat. In the parameters section, the body was displayed as an object in which microscopic changes had already begun. Increased resistance to distortion, accelerated processing of sensory signals, and an almost imperceptible but fixed line about a shift in the threshold of reaction to danger. Because of this, the brain now more often chose action instead of stupor. The protagonist read this and felt a mixture of fear and strange joy spread through his chest. For the first time in years, his internal reactions were turning into something something measurable and valuable, and not as a reason to blame it on those who constantly fall short of the desired standards. This feeling of recognition was dangerously attractive. With the interface collapsed, leaving only a small status symbol, the protagonist lay on his back, looking at the ceiling. For the first time since childhood, he was not afraid of tomorrow in the literal sense. He was afraid of checks, questions, possible restrictions, but the very thought of the next operation ceased to be a black hole of uncertainty. The morning brought new challenges before the illusion of calm had time to take hold. A rumor spread around the base that in the same industrial zone where they worked during the night, a brief, repeated surge in activity was recorded, followed by the disappearance of several external sensors. The command decided to send a small group there for inspection. The main character's last name was back on the list. This time he felt an internal response coming ahead of his thoughts, as if the system were pushing him to participate in advance. When the curator briefly explained that they needed a couple of people familiar with the terrain and nature of the zone, the protagonist merely nodded, without attempting to offer an alternative. The analytical department was already present in full force at the briefing before the departure. On the wall hung a projection of the internal map of the previous raid with anomalies marked. The area where the protagonist had undergone the 3-point synchronization now had a section marked yellow as potentially unstable, despite the operation having been completed. One of the analysts, with a stern face, noted that the previous report did not fully explain the appearance of a border entity on the periphery. He suggested using this trip as an opportunity to check whether any residual effects on the relief and energy of the area remain, paying attention to any deviations, including subjective ones. This phrase sounded almost like a direct invitation to test the protagonist again. He caught in several glances of his colleagues a wary curiosity that had previously been directed only at those who returned from rare awakenings, although no one officially said a word about his status. The road to the industrial zone seemed shorter than the previous one because the main character was not traveling as a statistical participant in the column, but as a person within whom another system was already working, listening to every change in the background. Every vibration of the car's suspension seemed to be a harbinger of the next decision. When the small group of battle hunters came out to the rift again, it looked calmer than the first time. The glow was dimmer, the hum weaker, but a slight pressure, like that of a taut rope, could still be felt nearby. This calmness seemed suspicious to the protagonist because the inner feeling did not match the visual picture, as if a new funnel had been hidden under the surface. This time, only a small group entered. A few combat hunters, the protagonist, and another contractor from his unit. The analyst remained outside, monitoring their readings on a tablet. This division emphasized that they were now becoming remote sensors, whose perception was more important than dry numbers. The inner world of the gate zone greeted them with a familiar gray valley, but the fog seemed thinner, and the lines on the stones are brighter, as if someone in their absence had gone over the surface with an invisible brush, emphasizing the pattern. This change was noticed not only by the protagonist, but also by the senior combat officer, who switched his attention from the map to the terrain. The gate system interface immediately came to life, recording that the carrier had returned to the previous synchronization zone, and proposed switching to observation mode without launching a new test, but with expanded sensitivity. The protagonist accepted this condition without hesitation, realizing that a second frontal test in a row could break even an adapted body. Step by step, the small group moved towards the 3 points. Where previously only barely noticeable seams on the stones shimmered, now a faint movement could be seen in the depths of the patterns, as if a viscous, luminous substance were flowing inside the rock, too slow for human perception, but clear for the new channel of senses. The senior combat officer stopped the group, raised his hand, and informed the analyst via radio that the terrain had changed more than expected for standard attenuation. At that moment, he caught a barely audible whisper, not a word, not a voice, but the friction of the wind against an invisible grate. The interface immediately responded with a short line about recording the secondary response. The protagonist realized that the next stage of testing would no longer be about that. Will he be able to survive inside an alien mechanism? And about that, will it be able to maintain this access when human mechanisms begin to squeeze it from all sides? Trying to figure out which camp to place the one who now half belongs to the gate system. The gray valley greeted them with the same dull silence that made any movement more distinct than in the ordinary world. The protagonist walked slightly behind the senior combat unit, carefully watching how the thin lines on the stones responded to the presence of the group, as if the surface itself remembered their previous passage and was now in no hurry to hide the traces of the changes. The interface operated in observation mode, not imposing any actions, but there was a sense of wariness in this calm. It seemed that the system itself was looking closely at the people around the main character, assessing not only the energy background of the zone, but also the behavior of those who could become no less a threat to him than any creature from the fog. The senior combat officer stopped at the first of 3 points. He knelt down on one knee and ran his hand along the stone seam, in the depths of which a faint movement of light was indeed flickering. Although he couldn't see the interface, his expression hardened, because even without any special sensations, the terrain here was already out of the ordinary. Through the general communication channel, the senior combat officer briefly reported to the outside that the residual activity has not dissipated, which means that the previous closure of the zone cannot be considered complete. He asked analysts to strengthen the recording of parameters. A dry confirmation came from the speaker in response, followed by silence from people who understood that the reports could suddenly escalate into an investigation. The small group moved further along the line of the previous synchronization, and with each step the protagonist felt a double pressure more and more strongly. One came from the zone itself and almost did not break the body thanks to adaptation. The other came from the views of living people, who involuntarily looked for early signs of danger in his reaction, as if he had become an unofficial indicator of anomalies. This attention was not overt hostility, but it had a cool helpfulness about it, the way a system or organization looks at a rare instrument. This is precisely what caused the main character's internal protest, because he knew too well how easily a person can be turned into a function if his qualities begin to interest his superiors more than his will. At the second point, the fog was denser than last time, but it didn't put pressure on the eyes, but seemed to gather in thin vertical layers, revealing areas of smooth surface beneath the stone. At one of these sites, the senior combat officer noticed something that looked like a seal, a broken symbol that no one present could immediately relate to the known markings of the gate. The analyst outside demanded a close-up recording, and the combat hunter turned on his chest camera to maximum zoom. However, the image immediately began to ripple, as if the symbol itself did not want to be saved in a standard format. This minor resistance from the environment caused even the most confident of the group to exchange quick, dissatisfied glances. The senior combat link's interface reacted more sharply, displaying a line about a conflict in monitoring protocols and warning that excessive fixation of the secondary response increases the likelihood of external pressure on the wearer. The meaning of these words was frighteningly clear. The more the League sees here that is superfluous, the faster attention will shift from the zone to the person already associated with it. The senior combat officer did not have time to think this thought through to the end. At the third point, the group came across a clear sign of recent movement. A few deep scratches in the rock, black dry drops, and a smeared patch of fog that didn't dissipate with the rest. It was as if something was watching them from the very seam between the visible and the hidden. The senior combat officer immediately ordered them to form a semicircle, sent the combat hunter closer to the exit, and stopped himself with a gesture nearby, not as a subordinate, but as a person who has already encountered something that came out of this zone. This tacit admission of ability was both flattering and alarming. This time, the senior combat officer noticed the movement first, not with his eyes, but thanks to his new sense of space. On the right side of the fog, the general pattern of sounds and pressure shifted slightly, as if a narrow living wedge had been cut out of the gray mass. Before the others realized the threat, he had already turned his head in the right direction. The entity did not launch an open attack, as last time. It only revealed itself for a second in a translucent layer of fog, a long outline for supporting limbs, a low seating position, an elongated body, and immediately disappeared. This was enough for the entire group to feel a sharp change in pace. A routine check turned into a cautious escort of an unaccounted predator. The combat hunter activated a short burst of light across the sector, but the beam passed through the gray haze without any apparent effect. After this, a command was received from the external channel to fix the point and not go any deeper until reinforcements arrived. During this pause, the analyst asked for the first time directly who exactly was the first to sense the deviation. The senior combat officer, without turning around, replied that the shift had been noticed at the same time, but his voice sounded too even and therefore unconvincing. He clearly didn't want to expose anyone in particular to unnecessary attention. However, the very emergence of such a question meant that the next pressure boundary no longer lay in the valley, and in protocols, interrogations, and official conclusions. The interface flashed almost painfully brightly and gave gave a short system block. External pressure verification is activated. The condition for maintaining access is to prevent the complete transfer of the cause and effect relationship to the carrier. This formulation literally made the senior combat officer shudder, because now the task sounded almost like a sentence to the person who said too much or became too noticeable. He realized that the system does not require lies in the literal sense. It requires surviving within someone else's interpretation of events, keeping oneself in the shadows. Not allow analysts to build a final scheme around it, where the anomaly, the essence, and the atypical reaction come together to form one conclusion that is easy to isolate. It was much more subtle than a simple fight. The group was led to the exit zone before reinforcements arrived. As soon as they got closer to the beacons and the familiar light of the portal, the senior combat officers were immediately asked not to disperse after returning to base, because the internal control department wanted to clarify the testimony. The polite wording did not hide the main point. He was already being considered a living source, and not just a participant in the raid. The way back passed in oppressive silence. Even those who usually like to recount the details of the clash now limited themselves to short phrases, as if the presence of the analytical department on the general radio network forced people to filter their intonations. The senior combat officer felt this disciplined silence gradually tightening around him like a soft noose. At the base, he was almost immediately taken not to the usual curator's office, but to the internal supervision block, where the walls were lighter, the doors heavier, and the air drier, as if even the oxygen there was supplied in a more official form. The architecture itself suggested that people were being brought here not for a friendly debriefing, but for a careful uncovering of discrepancies. There were 3 people waiting for him at the table: a familiar analyst, a representative of the medical sector, and a dry man in the uniform of the internal control department, who already had the timestamps of both raids, the group's movement trajectories, and biometric fragments open on his tablet. It seemed as if his life over the last 2 days had been turned into a case study. The conversation began formally. He was asked to confirm his personal information, record his general well-being, and list his sensations in the second exit zone. The senior combat officer answered calmly, trying to keep the rhythm even, because he understood. One moment of slack in breathing or intonation, and these people will immediately notice how the person hiding something more than ordinary fear becomes wary. The supervisor asked a question about the first contact with the entity, why it was the senior combat officer who was closest to the place where the creature emerged, and asked once again, slowly, to restore the sequence of movements down to the second. The analyst then added that, based on the recordings, his reaction looked statistically abnormal for a low rank, even taking into account luck and good motor skills. The senior combat officer looked at his hands folded on the table and felt an unpleasant, cold irritation rising inside him. It wasn't because of the accusations. There were no direct accusations yet, and because these people have already built a framework of the version, in which any unusual detail will sooner or later become a reason for stricter control. The interface didn't open completely, but a thin line pulsed in the left corner of my vision, indicating that I should keep the reasons vague. These words created an almost physical pressure in my temples, because the system's task now required not heroism, but discipline and psychological precision, qualities that the world's strong often possess better than the weak survivors. He replied that in critical moments he always acted automatically, without analyzing, and that in the first operation I simply found myself at an inconvenient distance due to a route check, and in the second he was among those who re-inspected the area. After that, he noticed indirect signs of the fog shifting, and only then the threat, like any observant contractor in his place. The supervisor did not argue, but asked a medical specialist to check the stress indicators. The medic attached thin sensors to his fingers and spent several minutes asking simple questions about pain, fatigue, dizziness, and fear. The senior combat officer answered as evenly as he could, recalling not the events themselves, but training methods for breathing control. When the instruments showed nothing but increased fatigue and residual adrenaline, the conversation shifted to a more dangerous plane. The analyst cautiously mentioned the possibility of rare latent shifts after contact with a special gate, without calling it a reawakening, but leaving the term hanging in the air as a bait to which perhaps many would react instinctively. The senior combat officer did not take the bait, but only said that if the League deemed it necessary, he was ready to undergo the standard check again. There was enough humility in this phrase for the bureaucracy, but no admission of any internal secret. This caused the warden to fall silent for a moment, and then to shift the conversation from the individual back to the characteristics characteristics of the zone itself. After an hour of careful pressure from the senior combat officer, he was released without being acquitted or charged, and leaving in a gray area between interest and suspicion. This intermediate status turned out to be, perhaps, even worse than a direct solution, because it meant that now they will watch him longer, more closely, and without warning, waiting for him to show the necessary crack. In the corridor, the curator caught up with him and, without stopping completely, quietly remarked that the departments above did not like blank spots in reports. This meant that the senior combat officer would have to be especially careful in the coming days. Don't stand out on raids. Don't argue. Don't act heroic. And don't create unnecessary reasons to raise the profile of someone with suspiciously good reflexes. The warning sounded almost human, without any formality, and therefore turned out to be more valuable than any standard advice. The raid supervisor clearly didn't want to hand him over to the surveillance system, but he couldn't cover forever, which meant that there was less time left until the next round of pressure than the protagonist's body, tired after the raids, had expected. That night in the barracks, no one bothered to talk. News spread faster than orders throughout the base, and the very appearance of the main character on the threshold already explained enough to his colleagues to refrain from asking unnecessary questions. A new expression appeared in their eyes, a mixture of respect, apprehension, and an instinctive desire not to get involved in other people's problems. The protagonist lay down without undressing completely, and only then allowed the interface to open completely, waiting for another dry block of information. Instead, for the first time, a nearly full-fledged assessment appeared before him. The external pressure verification was partially completed. The carrier retained access, preventing the anomaly status from being fully established in the external monitoring system. Below, a mark appeared about the intermediate award dash, passive masking of low-ranking causal anomalies, with the explanation that now the carrier's behavior within the limits of human interpretation will more often be perceived as luck, skill, or coincidence if direct evidence of deviation is not presented in sufficient quantity. The protagonist reread this formulation several times, at first not believing it, then gradually realizing the scale of what he had received. The system didn't just strengthen the body, it learned to protect its connection with itself from the hostile logic of those around it, creating a thin layer of plausibility, under which the anomaly could exist longer and become more dangerous for those who tried to open it too early. This reward was both reassuring and frightening, as it made him less vulnerable to immediate dissection. But in doing so, it drew them deeper into a game where neither the League's observers nor the system itself could be trusted to the end. Both structures sought to maintain control, simply in different ways and with different stakes on his life. In the morning, the protagonist woke up before the wake-up call, because the interface quietly flashed in the darkness of his field of vision without panic or sirens. By displaying a short line about the availability of the next development node, the transition required confirmed contact with a carrier with active external clearance, and below a shadow mark appeared, pointing not to the gate, but to the people inside the base itself. He sat up on his bunk, peering into the semi-darkness of the barracks where other contract soldiers were sleeping, tired, ordinary, unaware that the world around them had already begun to open up in a different way. At this moment, the main character felt especially clearly that the next stage would be more dangerous than the previous ones, not because that it has more power, but because it has less obvious enemy and more people. The morning light, filtering through the narrow window of the barracks, seemed paler than usual, as if the sky had grown tired during the night, along with the people. The main character just sat on the edge of the bed for a while, listening to the measured snoring of the neighbors and the subtle presence of the interface at the edge of consciousness, in no hurry to deploy it completely. The system did not push for immediate action, keeping the same short line about the new development node at the edge of attention, for activation of which contact with a carrier of active external access was required. These words did not sound like a simple quest, but like a carefully formulated intervention into the structure of the League. The protagonist understood that the bearer of external access meant a person, having influence beyond their level, able to enter and exit zones, inaccessible to ordinary contractors, and whose decisions are recorded not only in the base's reports, but also in political weight. The thought of such contact made him both interested and wary. During the formation, the protagonist's gaze automatically found the familiar emblem of the analytical department. The stern man with a tablet who asked unpleasant questions yesterday again stood slightly to the side of the general formation, observing the division of the unit according to tasks. The names on the list seemed to reach out to his pale voice. The raid supervisor, reading out the assignments for the next trips and shifts, This time, I didn't mention the main character among those who go into the field. Instead, after lining up, he briefly called out his last name and gestured for him to follow him, without explaining out loud. Several of the group exchanged quick glances, realizing that this was an invitation to enter corridors where privates were not usually invited. They went up one floor, where the corridors were quieter, the doors were thicker, and the signs outside the offices replaced the usual numbers with department designations. At one of these doors, marked as the Raid Coordination Department, a man in civilian clothes was already waiting for them. Without uniform, but with a neat League emblem on the lapel, similar to the seal on the treaties. The protagonist was invited inside and offered a chair and water. The man in the suit, who introduced himself as a liaison for the external sector, explained without further ado that a certain portion of the reports on recent raids has attracted the attention of more than just internal oversight, but also those who are involved in distributing promising personnel to protected areas. The wording was soft, but the essence was clear. Those at the top heard about the protagonist's atypical reaction and decided not to just observe, but to try to direct it. The liaison, as a person accustomed to selling solutions, spoke about the possibility of participating in a slow-growth program, where low-ranking contractors are matched with officers with external clearance. The proposal sounded almost like a dream for those stuck on the lower rungs. Working closer to the command center, participating in the preparation of operations, access to information that never reaches the rank and file. However, the protagonist felt that behind the beautiful words there was another layer, which the system in his interface saw more clearly. The interface did indeed respond when the liaison spoke the words about attaching to the outer sector officer. He flashed a thin line confirming the condition was met and added a clarification. That contact should not be formal, but stable, with regular intersection of information flows and trusted access. It sounded like the beginning of a long and dangerous attachment. The protagonist did not show his inner wariness, listened to all the details of the program, and found out that he is being offered a temporary redistribution from his current unit to the support department of one of the raid curators. This curator had the right to communicate directly with the central headquarters and sometimes accompany delegations to other cities. The curator's name meant nothing to the protagonist, but the messenger's voice carried a hint of respect as he pronounced it. This meant that we were not talking about an ordinary administrator, but about a person whose decisions had already influenced the fate of cities. Being around such a person meant simultaneously getting an opportunity and being under constant scrutiny. The curator of the current unit, who was present during the conversation, remained silent almost the entire time. Only at the end did he ask whether the protagonist understood that participation in such a program does not guarantee a rise in rank, but only gives the opportunity to express oneself in other areas. There was a hidden concern in the question, a desire to make sure he wasn't going there for empty illusions. The protagonist replied that he understood, and this was only partly true, because deep down there still lived the hope that there was a new path, even if not through the usual ranking tables, will allow him to one day leave the category of people whose lives are measured only by the number of boxes carried and operations survived. The consent was issued right there, a few quick electronic signatures, a note about the transfer. When the main character left the office, a notification about the change of assignment and the first time of arrival at the external coordination department was sent to his bracelet. The interface in the eyes dryly recorded that the external condition of the development node was fulfilled. The first day in the new department did not resemble the romantic idea of headquarters. The spacious room was lined with rows of tables with screens flashing with city maps, raid lists, timelines, and endless spreadsheets. People with headphones and microphones in their faces quickly exchanged coded phrases. The main character's new task was not to make heroic decisions, but to process reports and reconcile discrepancies, checking timestamps and preparing briefings for that very same curator he had only seen from afar. This tall man with a tired look and a soft but firm voice could stop an argument with one sentence. The interface did not turn off, but on the contrary, began to interact with a new environment, highlighting inconsistencies in data, the smallest shifts in time between reports from different departments. After a few hours of work, the protagonist discovered that he could find such inconsistencies faster than his colleagues, although officially this was attributed to attentiveness and a fresh perspective. One day, while reviewing two reports on raids in neighboring areas, the chief analyst noticed that both documents referred to the same time period, and an almost identical description of the unexpected stabilization of low-ranking gates after a brief surge. The interface immediately highlighted these phrases as a possible pattern that went beyond statistics. statistics. The lead analyst brought both reports onto a common screen, highlighted the repeating elements, and, after a short pause, sent a short internal note to the curators asking whether similar, as yet unaccounted for, mechanisms might be operating in different places. A few minutes later, he received an unexpected answer asking him to go up to the curator's office in person. The office was quiet, with large windows overlooking the training grounds and city maps with multicolored markers hanging on the walls. The curator, tearing himself away from the screen, looked closely at the chief analyst and noted that I didn't expect such analysis from a person of his current rank. He asked how the chief analyst had noticed such a subtle connection. The lead analyst explained frankly that he had begun to pay attention to repetitive wording and sense when a sequence of events seemed too smooth. He added that this reflected the feeling of the interface, which reacted to the hidden structures no less acutely than his own body to the pressure of the gate. The curator chuckled and noted that sometimes it is easier for those coming from below to see what the elders have already stopped noticing due to routine. He said that in the future he would personally review all of the chief analyst's notes, especially for any anomalous coincidences. This meant that now not only the system, but also a person with real influence listened to his conclusions. The interface responded immediately, displaying a silent notification about securing a stable channel with the external access carrier. Part of the development node turned active, and a new target appeared below it. Use the open channel not only to obtain information, but also to influence the choice of tactics when working with non-standard gates. This formulation seemed particularly risky to the chief analyst, since interference in decisions of this level could lead to conflict with a league. If anyone notices that an unknown low-ranking contractor is influencing routes and priorities at the same time, this held the potential to steer part of the world onto a safer trajectory. In the following weeks, the chief analyst continued to carry out his work in the department, and gradually his place in the structure was consolidated. The chief analyst's colleagues stopped perceiving him as a temporary inclusion and began to pass on some of the complex reports to him, noting that he is better at finding strange coincidences and inconsistencies. The curator repeatedly called the chief analyst to discuss the latest reports. Each call was accompanied by a slight burst of activity from the interface, which monitored not only the content of the conversations, but also the emotional background. Sometimes, when it came to non-standard cases of gate stabilization, the chief analyst felt how the system nudges him towards certain questions, pointing out previously unnoticed places in the reports. One day, the curator, leafing through a report on a series of minor anomalies on the outskirts, unexpectedly asked how the chief analyst felt about the theories about that the gates may not be just random natural disasters, but part of a wider mechanism in which people, not only victims, but also potential controls. This question touched upon the internal conflict of the chief analyst, since the system that lives in his perception behaved like something from the other side, trying not to destroy his world immediately, but to integrate him into its processes. The chief analyst cautiously responded that for now he prefers to rely on verifiable facts, but allows for the possibility of a more complex structure. The curator nodded thoughtfully and noted that the League sometimes lacked people capable of seeing the essence of the pattern behind a set of individual attacks and rifts. He added that such people find themselves between a rock and a hard place because a complex look frightens those who are used to working according to instructions and reports without asking unnecessary questions. The chief analyst took this conversation with him as an inner stone, which can neither be thrown away nor hidden too deeply, since it has already changed the balance. In the evening, returning to the barracks, the chief analyst opened the interface again to see how the system reacted to the first direct contact with a person who feels that the world is not controlled by the League alone. At that moment, the chief analyst realized that he had awakened anew in his body, but with a new understanding and connection to the system. A new line has appeared in the status. The influence on the trajectory of external decisions has been registered. The level of influence is minimal, but sufficient to fix the node. Two specific changes were listed below: a minor adjustment to the timing of one of the raids and a shift in the composition of the group in another, accepted by the curator after discussion. The chief analyst did not immediately understand the meaning of these lines, and when he did, a heavy feeling of responsibility arose in his chest. Every such shift, even if it saves lives now, can change the balance of power in the future. That he will be inundated not only with gratitude, but also with the blow of those who had expected a different outcome. The system suggested activating the following passive function, which enhances the chief analyst's ability to recognize hidden connections between events, warning that with an increase in this parameter, the risk of cognitive overload increases if the wearer does not maintain a balance between external tasks and internal stabilization. The chief analyst agreed, realizing that a refusal at this point would be tantamount to stopping growth. And a stop in the gate world almost always turns into a slow lag. At that very moment, he felt how the usual daytime impressions seemed to be stratified into lines, connecting one thing to another, and the brain begins to see chains of cause and effect where previously there was only a series of facts. In the following days, this manifested itself in everything, from little things, like who crosses paths with whom more often in the cafeteria and what conversations then emerge in the corridors, until the distribution of tasks between the detachments depending on the latest reports. Sometimes this clarity was more frightening than the fog inside the gate, because it revealed not only the motives of others, but also one's own weaknesses. The chief analyst tried not to show the changes, joking with colleagues. Completed tasks slightly faster than average, but not so much that it was noticeable. Only occasionally did he catch the curator's attentive gaze, which lacked the previous skepticism, but only a cautious interest in what he will become if he is not broken before his time. One evening, when the department was already emptying and only the routine diagrams were flashing on the screens, the curator asked the chief analyst to stay for a couple of minutes. Having closed the door, the curator quietly announced that higher up the line they already knew about the chief analyst's anomalous reaction in the last rates, but for now they preferred to consider it a useful rarity rather than a threat. He added that much depended on how long the chief analyst could remain useful and unnoticed at the same time. These words sounded to the chief analyst like a reflection of the task set by the system. He couldn't help but smile, because he clearly saw how the League and the incomprehensible power of the gate, each in its own way, require him to walk a fine line, neither falling towards complete loyalty nor towards a complete break. When the chief analyst returned to the barracks, Interface was already waiting for him with a quiet flash and a short summary of the day. The development node has been activated. The channel with the external access carrier has been stabilized. The next level will become available at the first direct conflict of interest between the League and the system. This formulation froze in the mind of the chief analyst as a harbinger of a future blow that has not yet come, but which will inevitably come. In the following days, the base lived its usual rhythm. Raids came and went. Lists on the board were updated more often than the marker nodes could fade. At first glance, nothing indicated an impending turning point, but the chief analyst felt it, as if beneath the smooth surface a tension was brewing, similar to that which precedes the opening of the gate. The interface behaved calmly all this time, did not issue new nodes, only tracked minor shifts in the data, noting how often the curator's name appears in reports of complex operations and how the time lag between the detection of anomalies and the League's response changes. It seemed that the system, too, was preparing for the moment when the trajectories would finally intersect. One morning, the External Coordination Department received an urgent message from Central Headquarters. A map of a neighboring region flashed on the screens, where two unstable faults opened almost simultaneously in the suburban area. One is low-ranking, closer to residential areas. The other is more powerful, deeper in the industrial zone. The League clearly did not have enough time to deploy its full forces. The meeting took place in the department at a long table with a map projection. The curator, several officers, and a representative of the analytical block gathered to discuss a tough choice. Direct the main forces to more powerful gates, capable of causing an uncontrolled release, or to smaller ones, but located closer to residential areas, where even a small delay could lead to casualties. The officers argued, citing figures and arguments. Some insisted on suppressing the strong fault, warning of catastrophic consequences for the region. Others recalled the political significance of mass casualties in residential areas. The curator saw in these words a familiar dilemma. When the world is momentarily divided into two branches, each of which brings about the death of another. The curator remained silent longer than anyone else, running his finger along the line between 2 points on the map. He noted that he did not have enough data to make a decision. The structure of low-ranking gates in the residential sector and the latest information on residual activity. If the spike's sudden stabilization pattern appears there again, betting on a major break will become justified. At that moment, the interface in the curator's eyes flashed with a bright light and displayed a line with information about the registered node of direct conflict of interest. The system requested that the total losses of potential carriers be minimized and recommended that priority be given to operational intervention in the area of the smaller gates. Despite the greater strength strength of the second fault. This demand affected several levels of consciousness. Unlike the League, which assessed value by the scale of destruction, the system took into account the quantity and quality of human lives, capable of becoming carriers of power, and for the sake of preserving them, she was ready to risk a larger anomaly with fewer people. The chief observer stood a little behind with a tablet in his hands, formally listening, but internally feeling the growing tension. He understood that both sides were pulling him in different directions. The League insisted on suppressing the strong rift, and the system demanded the protection of those whom the headquarters crews could sacrifice for the sake of strategic victory. The curators suddenly turned to the chief observer to ask for his assessment of the situation, given the strange cases of stabilization of low-ranking gates recorded in the reports. This question was not formal, but an invitation to participate in a decision-making process where every word could change destinies. The interface narrowed the field of view to two options: repeat the position of the majority and concentrate forces on a powerful fault, losing some of the potential and trust of the system, or take a risk and prioritize the residential sector, thereby conflicting with the headquarters logic. The chief observer felt his fingers tighten around the edge of the tablet, and a familiar feeling rose in his chest, which once made his boyish gaze turn upwards, despite the screams. Now, in an adult body, this feeling pushed him to where choice ceased to be a safe theory. He cleared his throat to save his voice, and suggested that, based on the totality of cases of stabilization of weak gates within the city limits, there is a possibility of the manifestation of a rare, an unaccounted factor that the League is not yet able to measure. Losing such an opportunity would be a strategic mistake, in addition to the obvious risk to residents. This analytical suggestion was made carefully, without mentioning the system or potential, but it caused a silence in the room. The analyst frowned and asked if the chief observer thought it possible that the final manifestations of new types of anomalies might be occurring in low-ranking gates. The chief observer nodded and added that, based on experience in recent months, the most unusual cases did not occur in hotspots, and on the periphery, where protocol allows more freedom of maneuver. To ignore this trend because it didn't fit with conventional models was to repeat the mistakes of past algorithms. The curator looked attentively at the chief observer, expressing neither irritation nor obvious agreement, only heavily weighing what he had heard. In the end, the curator accepted the risk. The main combat unit will head to the residential sector, and a reinforced but smaller group will take on the more powerful fault. The analytics department was supposed to prepare an explanation of the decision for headquarters. This decision became a point of no return. The interface confirmed the activation of the conflict node, the match between the carrier's selection and the system priority. A wave of icy cold passed through the depths of the curator's consciousness, not from fear, but from the realization that he had become complicit in the redefinition of the League's priorities. The raids began within half an hour, and work in the coordination department intensified. Multiple communication channels, cross-queries, and clarifications made it impossible to track everything in real time. But the curator managed to see how the vehicles and detachments were distributed in two directions and what the delay was on each route. The interface focused on the line to the low-ranking gates in the residential sector, updating the risk assessment every 10 minutes and gradually reducing it as forces are deployed. In the corner of the view there remained a scale associated with a powerful fault, where the readings remained alarmingly high. Initial reports from the scene showed that the choice in the residential area had been correct. Within the weak gate, an anomalous node quickly manifested itself, a hidden structure capable of causing an explosive growth of anomalies if the forces arrived late. Thanks to the early arrival of the main group, the core was contained without serious losses. The situation in the industrial zone turned out to be worse. The powerful rift acted like a deep crack, releasing entities more complex than the standard level. The reinforced but smaller group sent there was forced to request reserves, which physically could not appear in the next few hours. Timestamps, coordinates, and fragments of tactical diagrams flashed on the screens of the coordination room. Each new request from the industrial zone sounded like a distant blow, which the curator felt almost physically, understanding that these people are missing exactly to the extent that they themselves have redistributed their forces. The interface did not comment on what was happening, recording only a decrease in the overall risk for potential carriers and an increase in local risk for part of the combat unit. His dry indifference to specific people cut deeper than any emotion, reminding me that for the system, every decision is always weighed against the lives of others. After several hours of tension, when operations in both sectors had entered their final phase, the first official official summary message was received. In the residential area, it was possible to avoid mass casualties, with only a few injuries recorded. The death toll in the industrial zone turned out to be significantly higher than it would have been if the main forces had been sent there. A heavy silence fell over the coordination department. People looked at the screens, read the list of names, and understood that the curator's decision was supported by his analysis, modified this table, removing some names and adding others. No statistics could hide the fact that they were faced with a choice where there were initially no good outcomes. The curator was silent for a long time, and then quietly stated that the headquarters would accept this decision as strategically justified, but those who lost people in the industrial zone will remember not the dry formulations about risk optimization, but the moment when they were sent there in a smaller group. The curator took responsibility for this choice. After the meeting, the curator walked out into the corridor with a feeling of emptiness inside. Not joy for those saved and not grief for those lost, but a strange, dull fatigue. Thoughts about the rightness of the action seemed too expensive, for each such thought drew a new line between those who remained and those who were no longer there. The interface waited until the curator was alone in the empty meeting room, and only then deployed a new block. The direct conflict node was completed, system priority was maintained, and the carrier's clearance was expanded. Below, without emotion, was a note about the reward: an increase in the parameter of adaptation to moral pressure and increased resistance to cognitive dissonance. The curator read this and felt a chill down his spine. The system didn't try to ease his guilt. It only strengthened his ability to live with the fact that his words had influenced someone else's death. This enhancement seemed to the curator to be one of the most terrible rewards one could receive. A new line has appeared in the main carrier status. The system's trust in him increased, and they noted nearby that in the future, more complex intervention options will be available to him. Structure of decisions subject to continued alignment with the priorities of minimizing potential losses. It felt like a gentle but insistent call to delve deeper into the area where human assessments of the value of life begin to diverge. That same evening, the chief carrier was again summoned to the overseer, who wanted to hear his version of what had happened. This time the questions were not about a personal anomaly, but about the logic of the decision taken. The lead carrier remained outwardly calm and explained that the totality of the data indicated the need to protect the residential sector, without mentioning that some of the arguments came not from the reports, but from the silent interface. The supervisor listened attentively, took notes, and sometimes asked leading questions about, doesn't the chief carrier consider it dangerous to base decisions on patterns that haven't yet been proven? The main carrier replied that in a world where the gate itself is an anomaly, waiting for full proof of any pattern almost always means arriving too late. At the end of the conversation, the overseer noted that some at the top would be glad to see a human being in the main carrier, ready to take responsibility for difficult decisions. But he warned that others might look to him as a convenient scapegoat if the bet turned out to be wrong, and advised him to keep this in mind in advance. The main carrier came out of there with an even heavier burden than after the first interrogation, because now he understood. The system pushed him to make a choice. The League took advantage of this choice, and living people will have to answer for the consequences, whose names are already written into the reports, and whose families are unlikely to read the strategic justifications. At night, lying in the barracks and looking into the darkness, where the indicators of the bracelets charging on the nightstands were barely glowing, the main carrier opened the interface again and looked at the new lines about system trust and extended access. For the first time in his life, he seriously asked himself whether he was gradually becoming an instrument of power, who regards people as a resource as coldly as many of the League's advisors. The system didn't respond, only quietly pulsing its status symbol. The main carrier closed the interface and made the only possible decision for himself for now. If he is destined to stand on the border between two logics human and the one that comes from the gates, he will remember the specific faces behind the numbers every time, even if his ability to live with it grows. Towards morning, when sleep washed over him like a heavy wave, the interface quietly flared up for the last time and added a short note to the status. The next node will become available at the first conscious refusal to follow the direct priority of the system. This line, appearing on the edge of consciousness, seemed like a promise that true freedom of choice was still ahead, but the price for it may be higher than any power. The morning after that choice came as routinely as the dozens of previous ones. The wake-up call, the noise in the shower, the smell of cheap soap and washing powder in the corridors of the barracks. A subtle tremor still ran through the main carrier's being, as if the body had not fully returned from those 2 points on the map where where everything had recently been divided into the saved and the dead. The interface was silent, as if it was also digesting the consequences, only occasionally pulsing its status symbol, barely noticeably, reminding that somewhere deep down a new knot has already been secured. The next step was now connected not with external demands, but with the fact that one day the main carrier will decide for itself, contrary to the direct priority of the system. He noticed that he had become more attentive to small details that had previously slipped past his consciousness. For example, he noticed that one of the contract soldiers always lowered his eyes when he saw the list of the dead, because each new list might contain a name he is afraid to see. He also noticed that conversations in the dining room were avoiding the topic of the recent raids, as if not wanting to give words power. In the external coordination department, the day began with the usual routine: reports, summaries, planning of trips. There was still a hidden weariness in the air, as if even the screens with the flashing new maps were a little dimmer than before. The lead carrier saw how the curator, looking through the reports, lingered his gaze on the lost graphs and silently clenched his jaw. The interface highlighted familiar anomalous patterns in the reports, the repetition of strange wording and synchronous bursts at different points. But this time the system did not offer immediate solutions. It only recorded how the world continued to behave precariously. Amidst these small tremors, the main carrier waited for what would become the real reason for a new rupture of trajectories. This reason did not come from external news, but from a specific order. Closer to midday, the department received an encrypted package from central headquarters. After decryption, it turned out that the League was going to carry out a major purge of one of the old districts, built before the gates appeared, where spontaneous micro-breakthroughs have become more frequent in recent months. According to the official version, the area had too high a level of residual instability, and the housing there had long been in need of major reconstruction. And the city administration agreed to the temporary relocation of residents on condition that the League will fully take on the neutralization of all possible anomalous centers, including potential hidden seeds of the gate. On the map, the operation looked almost routine: a large square of blocks marked with a red grid, force deployment arrows, evacuation points. However, the interface on the main carrier immediately responded with a high-risk warning: purges of unregistered carriers and the possible loss of atypical connections between the gates and people. This formulation sounded like a blow to him, because he already knew that the system considers people with a certain response not just victims or civilians, but potential links in its mechanism. Now the League was going to, without knowing it, burn out an entire layer of those who could one day become the same anomalous carriers as himself. The curator, studying the order, noted that the operation would be difficult politically. The area is old and dense. Those who survive the first gate live there, and the resettlement is temporary only on paper. In fact, some people will never return there, because money and resources will find a way to prevent full recovery. One officer cynically suggested that perhaps this was for the better. Fewer people would be living on a powder keg. There was weariness in his voice. The analyst added dryly that statistics from recent years show areas with repeated micro-breakthroughs sooner or later become either disaster centers or zones where the League constantly loses people in cleanups. At this point, the interface displayed a new line: System Priority Dash. Preserve the maximum number of non-standard response carriers, even at the risk of increasing background instability. Below, as a formal condition of the next node, was a conscious refusal to follow this priority in favor of one's own human assessment. The main carrier looked at these words for a long time, feeling how inside him there rose not the usual fear or anticipation, but a heavy, viscous resistance. The system actually required him to name a price for which he would be willing to put people above the cold calculations of even that side, which had already saved his life more than once and raised him above his previous limits. The curator suddenly asked if the chief carrier had any reports on this area in his personal archives. He realized that the moment of choice was approaching not in the abstract, but in a concrete task. They were going to send several teams to the area for total prevention, which in the League's inverted language meant burning everything down, which is not in line with the norm, even if it does not pose a direct threat yet. The lead carrier pulled up old reports and saw that the area had come up in reports several times. Flashes, strange resonances, people complaining of headaches near certain intersections. Among these lines, he found mention of several people with an unusual resistance to the proximity of the gates, almost verbatim coinciding with his own childhood symptoms. The interface confirmed that the area was above average in terms of the presence of carriers of a similar type and added a dry note: note. When performing an operation according to the League protocol, the expected loss of unique potential is high. This assessment no longer sounded like a theoretical note, but as an almost personal statement that the system does not want to lose potential future carriers. If previously conflicts of interest concerned the distribution of power and the choice between two fault lines, now we were talking about people who don't even know about the existence of the system and the gates as a mechanism. They just live in an awkward area where the sky once cracked and now the League gathers without knowing it, to clean out an entire layer of those who could one day become the same anomalous carriers as himself. The curator finished reading the order and the reports, sighed, and, without hiding his fatigue, announced that they did not have the authority to cancel such decisions. The most that the mobile headquarters can do is carefully adjust the cleanup tactics, shifting the emphasis towards evacuation and targeted neutralization. But this will require additional resources, which the base is already lacking. At this moment, the protagonist felt that his own assessment of the situation was at odds with both the system and the League. Both sides viewed the area as a set of risks and opportunities, while for the protagonist it was a fragment of childhood, where people who looked like his mother walked along the cracked streets. The thought that they were going to be preventively cleaned out caused a burst of rage in the protagonist. The system interface detected this condition, pulsing with a warning that failure to follow the system's priority may result in the loss of some support and a reduction in the effectiveness of future adaptations. Formally, this looked like a sober warning about the danger of going against the source of power, but was emotionally perceived by the protagonist as an attempt to keep him on the right side. The protagonist exhaled slowly, trying to separate his desire to protect the area from the real possibilities. He realized that he couldn't directly disrupt the operation, but he could influence the tactics of its implementation if he convinced his curator of that. That a total purge is not only inhumane, but also strategically disadvantageous, since it destroys a potentially useful resource of people for the League. The idea of using the League's own language against its usual logic seemed to the protagonist to be the only way to reconcile his inner sense of justice with reality, in which emotional arguments do not matter. The protagonist collected all the reports and headed to the curator's desk, feeling how each step along the corridor marked a new trajectory for his life. The protagonist laid out the reports in front of the curator, highlighting cases of unusual resistance of residents to the proximity of the gates, showed correlations with other areas where such people later became more stable hunters. Calmly and without pathos, he explained that a total cleanup in such a place is not only an ethical issue, but also a banal waste of a rare resource. The curator was silent for a long time, leafing through the pages and examining the highlighted places on the map. He then acknowledged that such arguments are not well received at the top, where there is a growing belief that people are more easily replaced by technology and barriers. However, the curator noted that there are still those within the League who cares that reports include not only percentages, but also individuals. The curator added that he could try to change the structure of the operation from within without canceling the order, proposing a selective filtering model instead of a total cleansing of individual squares. The district will be divided into sectors, additional testing of residents will be conducted, and those whose indicators are potentially useful will remain on the priority resettlement list. The system interface immediately displayed a notification that the proposed scenario reduces the loss of potential carriers, but does not correspond to the direct priority of the system, which would prefer to leave the entire area out of the cleanup. The system warned that agreeing to this compromise would be considered a partial rejection of its model, sufficient to activate the conscious refusal node if the decision is made consciously. The protagonist felt like he was standing on a fine line, where any word he said in a conversation with his curator could become either a bridge or a blade. He stated that he would support this option, since a complete refusal of the operation would lead to a conflict with the city authorities and, most likely, to a new wave of unregulated breakthroughs, which will affect other areas. The curator looked at the main character with a long, very human gaze, in which fatigue was mixed, doubts and respect for a person who does not try to hide behind other people's decisions. The curator noted that in this situation, no one will leave the room clean, but if we can save at least some of the people without causing chaos, it will be more than usual. The operation was rewritten within a few hours. We added a preliminary testing stage for residents, expanded the evacuation block, and reduced the power of barrier volleys in residential areas, while increasing them in empty industrial areas. Each point of the new instructions became a small compromise between fear, pragmatism, and an attempt to maintain at least some measure of fairness. awareness. The system interface flickered at the edge of my vision the whole time, as if watching how the main character, with his own hands, diminishes her ideal version in terms of potential. When the final version of the plan was sent up for approval, the system returned a dry line. The condition of conscious refusal is partially fulfilled. Support is reduced. Adaptation will require more effort. The protagonist felt something inside him shrink, as if part of the invisible support had disappeared from under his feet. The world around me became heavier for a moment. The colors faded. The sounds in the department became louder, without the usual soft filter with which the system may have enveloped his perception. This stark exposure of reality was both frightening and sobering. At night, when most had already gone to the barracks, the main character sat alone at an empty table. He had printouts of the operation plan in front of him, and he was trying to understand. Did he really make a human choice, or did he simply choose a different form of calculation? Slightly less brutal, but still built on someone's lives, reduced to lines in a report. The system interface did not argue or justify itself. It just quietly added a note to the status about it. That the node of conscious refusal is activated. The expansion of freedom of choice is recorded. Below, a new passive function has appeared, strengthening one's own emotional inertia, allowing one to hold a chosen position longer under the pressure of conflicting priorities. This ability did not provide any strength in combat or analytics, but seemed the most valuable to the main character, because she promised to at least slightly protect that part of him, who still remembered the living faces behind the numbers and did not want to turn entirely into an instrument of either side, no matter what power they offer in return. Returning to the barracks along the dark corridor, the main character saw the faces of those who have already fallen asleep, not knowing what decisions other people will make for them tomorrow. The protagonist caught himself thinking that the real abyss does not lie in faults and systems, and in the difference between how easy it is to write the word losses in a report and how difficult it is to pronounce names out loud. Before going to bed, the protagonist opened the interface one last time and saw a quiet, almost unnoticeable line at the bottom of the status. Further growth will be based not only on alignment with the system's priorities, but also on the carrier's ability to maintain its own. It reminded the protagonist that the path he had taken now belonged to him no less than to any force trying to guide him. The operation in the old area began to be prepared so thoroughly, as if it was a question of completely crossing the front, and not about neighborhoods with peeling paint and old balconies, where in the evenings it still smelled of fried oil and cheap cigarettes. The protagonist, looking at the map, could not shake the feeling that a new language of war would now be written at these crossroads. The external coordination department laid out a map of the district by sectors, and each street was marked with route lines. Residents' assembly points were marked with green circles, and potential cleanup sites were marked with hard red squares. Only the protagonist saw on top of this layer another network of possible non-standard responses from people not displayed in any official interface. The interface was silent, no longer offering any more ideal scenarios, but at the bottom of the status, an already activated mark was glowing, indicating a conscious refusal to follow the previous priority. It became increasingly difficult for the protagonist to perform analytical operations, as if part of the usual computational support now lay entirely on his shoulders. On the day of the operation, several columns left the base at once. Some of the equipment was sent directly to the area, while others were supposed to cover the outer borders to prevent a spontaneous flight of residents. The protagonist traveled as part of a mobile headquarters in an armored coordination vehicle, where instead of firing slits, there were wide monitors with a map. On the way, the main character looked out the window at the changing neighborhoods. New high-rise buildings, glass facades of shopping centers, then ever lower buildings and old signs with faded letters. When the first gray walls of the district appeared ahead, the protagonist's heart sank painfully. It was in courtyards like these that a boy who didn't yet know the word gate once kicked a ball around. The mobile headquarters was set up on the edge of the square where there was once a market, now filled with temporary tents for evacuation services. People were already gathering around, some with bags, some with cages in which domestic animals were rustling. Some were simply empty-handed, but still felt the invisible weight of what they had not taken with them. The curator stood at the screens, coordinating communications between the combat teams, evacuation, and analysts. He was tasked with monitoring the segment related to preliminary testing of residents. On one of the monitors, windows with parameters coming from the field scanners were already appearing. Simple by the standards of the system, but still too crude for fine measurements. The interface increased sensitivity as the first groups of residents began to pass through temporary diagnostics diagnostic corridors. Soft outlines appeared in the field of vision around those who gave a slight response of an unusual type. Several people, teenagers, several adults with old injuries received during the first breakthroughs. Each of them became a small luminous node for the system. For the League, according to the updated tactics, these people fell into the priority category for resettlement and further observation. It was better than just being listed as a loss, but it left a bitter taste in the system, since the ideal scenario would be that there would be no such cleanups in high-potential areas. The curator, watching the faces that appeared for a second in the scanner's frame, tried not to think about what they might become in 10 years. Hunters, analysts, or simply people who know how to live next to the cracks in the world without losing their heads. These thoughts only reinforced the feeling that any choice here was just a form of damage. As expected, not all residents calmly accepted the decision to temporarily relocate. A quarrel broke out on one of the side streets. Someone refused to leave, claiming that he had already experienced one disaster and was not going anywhere. To prevent panic that could have disrupted the operation schedule, a team with psychologists and additional personnel was sent there. The interface recorded these bursts of emotion as additional noise in the overall picture. But this time he did not interfere, leaving the curator the right to decide how to react to each individual episode. He noticed that now the thought of people resisting orders no longer irritated him, and almost respect for those who still clung to their street as if it were their last island. In parallel with the evacuation, cleanup teams began working. Instead of the carpet-like method of moving through squares, as was in the original order, they moved pointwise to already confirmed hotspots. Every time a strong residual background radiation was detected in one of the buildings, it was necessary to choose between preserving the structure and completely destroying the building. In one of these buildings, an old 5-story building with slanted entrances, scanners recorded an unusually high resonance on the 3rd floor. A small team was sent there with a portable barrier and enhanced detectors. The curator requested a direct visual feed via an internal channel so he could personally see what was happening, even though this was not formally part of his duties. The camera showed a narrow staircase, peeling railings, drawings on the walls, and a room where a man with thick black hair was sitting on the floor. He looked out the window at the street where evacuation buses were already parked. When people in bulletproof vests entered the room, the man did not scream or cry, but only clutched the battered toy tighter in his hands. The scanners around him showed a level of background immunity that even many hunters hadn't seen. The interface before the curator's eyes flashed in several layers, marking in the man a node of potential connection with the gate, so pure that it seemed not an accident, but almost the world's response to its own cracks. According to the League's protocol, such people were now to be transferred to a special category list with subsequent medical and mental observation, which was a semi-official preparation for recruitment. The curator, having seen the indicators, instructed that the person be treated with the utmost care as a fragile but important element of future programs. The interface, on the contrary, issued a stern warning. The system's priority demanded that the person be left in the natural environment as an independent node and not be subordinated to the League's programs. This recommendation sounded almost like a demand to restore his right to grow up outside of foreign structures, even if it meant greater uncertainty and risk for the world. The curator felt the same suffocating feeling inside as on the day of the first rift over the city, when the world itself decided who would remain on top and who would go underground. Now two forces were again dividing the fate of a man who did not yet understand any of these logics. I just sat on the floor with a toy and looked at other people's faces. One of the fighters asked over the line what to do with a man: evacuate with the others or leave them in place until a special team arrives. The curator turned his gaze to the fighter, as if expecting him to offer an argument that would determine who would obey their decision. The gate system or the League protocols. The interface flashed red, reminding them of its priority, and the status at the bottom of the screen quietly indicated the newly activated conscious denial node. It seemed that the world deliberately placed the curator face to face with situations where it was impossible to hide behind other people's formulas. And one day he will have to answer who he considers more important, a person or structure that could make him stronger. The curator exhaled and decided to evacuate the man and his family to a priority resettlement unit, with a note about non-standard indicators, but without immediate removal and transfer to a research center. He understood that too harsh a step would destroy the trust of those who were already reluctant to agree to evacuation, and will deprive a person of the right to at least partially choose his own path in the future. The curator nodded, conveyed the instructions in a short form, and the interface immediately immediately responded, recording that the carrier has again chosen a compromise solution, partially contradicting the direct priority of the system. The level of support has decreased slightly, leaving the curator with more and more space for his own, but heavy, responsibility. The operation continued until the evening. Every hour of it was filled with the same small ones, but with sharp decisions, where it was impossible to achieve the ideal either for the system or for the League. It was necessary to choose which layer of the world to wound a little less. By the end of the day, the curator felt tired, not so much from work, how much from the constant confrontation with how easily people turn into variables. When the main cleanup teams returned, the area looked both familiar and alien. Some houses were still standing, life was still visible in the windows, but there were no people there. Others were empty, with broken windows, and on the walls, where the laundry had once hung, there were now traces of the temporary barrier fastenings, like scars from someone else's surgery. The loss total turned out to be lower than predicted for a total cleanup. Some damaged housing, a few injured during evacuation, and no fatalities among residents. Below, almost unnoticeable to the layman, there was a line about 3 soldiers who died under a collapse while neutralizing a deep source of fire in an empty building. For the League, these 3 names were within the limits of acceptable risk. For the system, they were a number that did not affect the overall assessment of the remaining potential. For the curator, it was another reminder that whenever he tries to maintain a delicate balance, someone still falls on the side where he didn't have time to put his hand out, because there simply aren't enough hands. At the end of the operation, a short tactical test was conducted at the mobile headquarters. The analyst acknowledged that the selective filtering model performed better than expected. The curator received a sparse approval over a closed channel, but only he heard in this approval the weight of the unspoken. Next time, they may not be able to exercise such freedom of maneuver if the political background changes. The interface waited until the cars left the area and night finally fell on the charred walls, and only then did it display a new summary. The conscious denial node is deepened, emotional inertia is stabilized, access to some combat adaptations is temporarily limited until the carrier restores the energy resource independently. This restriction hit the curator harder than he expected. His body, accustomed to subtle support in perception and reaction, became a little heavier, movements less accurate. He understood that the system does not punish.